I am Nia, 32 years old, and the night I gave birth to my daughter was supposed to be the happiest moment of my life. Instead, as I lay in an Atlanta hospital bed enduring agonizing contractions, the door opened to reveal my husband of 5 years. But he was not alone. He was tightly gripping the hand of his 23-year-old assistant Chloe, who was sobbing into his shoulder. He looked me dead in the eye and demanded I give up my VIP delivery suite for his mistress, claiming she was carrying his unborn son and needed the luxury more than I did. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply packed my bags and moved to a standard room. But by sunrise, I made a single phone call that stripped him of his wealth, his freedom, and his family legacy. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled his entire life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that a woman's silence is never weakness, but just her taking time to reload. The transition from my quiet living room to that sterile hospital memory is still sharp. It was a Tuesday night in late October. The rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the birthing center at Atlanta Medical. This was not just any room. It was the premier VIP maternity suite, the one Marcus insisted we book months in advance to maintain the image of our perfect, wealthy family. It had a soaking tub velvet guest chairs and a panoramic view of the city skyline. But all that luxury meant absolutely nothing. As the sheer agony of a level 10 contraction ripped through my abdomen, I gripped the cold metal rails of the hospital bed, squeezing my eyes shut as the pain radiated from my lower back all the way down to my knees. The only sound in the massive room was the rhythmic, steady beep of the fetal heart monitor. It was the only reassurance that my little girl was safe, even as my own body felt like it was splitting in half. I was sweating, exhausted, and completely terrified. And more than anything, I was entirely alone. Where was Marcus? That was the question looping in my dizzy brain for the past 6 hours. My water had broken at noon, while I was finalizing quarterly reports for my business, a business, by the way, that Marcus knew absolutely nothing about. I called him immediately. It went straight to voicemail. I called his office. His secretary told me he had stepped out for an urgent client meeting and could not be reached. So I drove myself to the hospital, white-knuckling the steering wheel through Atlanta traffic, breathing through the early stages of labor alone. As the hours dragged on and the afternoon turned into a stormy night, my calls to him remained unanswered. The nurses kept giving me sympathetic looks. You know the look, the soft, pitying tilt of the head when they asked if they should try calling the father one more time. I told them no. I told myself he was just caught up in a major acquisition for his family's investment fund. I told myself he would burst through the door any minute with a massive bouquet of roses, apologizing profusely, kissing my forehead and telling me how brave I was. I clung to that fantasy because the alternative, the reality that my husband had abandoned me during the birth of our first child, was too heavy to carry on top of the physical pain. Another contraction hit harder than any of the previous ones. I groaned, biting down on my dry lip until I tasted blood. The pain was a blinding, white-hot wave that consumed my entire existence. I reached out blindly, desperate for a hand to hold, for a voice to tell me I could do this. My fingers brushed against the empty sheets beside me. The vastness of the VIP suite suddenly felt suffocating. The velvet chairs sat empty. The catered fruit tray sat untouched. The silence in the room, save for the relentless beeping of the monitor, was deafening. I pressed the call button, my hand shaking violently. A nurse named Sarah hurried in, her face etched with concern. She checked my vitals and told me I was dilating quickly. It was almost time. She asked again if there was anyone she could call a sister, a friend, my mother-in-law. Just the thought of Vivian, my mother-in-law, made my stomach turn. She would only use my vulnerability as another reason to point out how unfit I was for her precious son. I shook my head, fighting back tears of sheer exhaustion. I told Sarah I was fine. I could do it alone. Sarah nodded sympathetically, adjusting the IV drip in my arm, before stepping out to check on the doctor. Left alone once more, I stared at the ceiling, trying to focus on my breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. I visualized my baby girl, imagining her face, promising her that no matter what happened, I would protect her. I was pulling strength from a place deep within my soul, preparing to bring life into this world completely solo. And then I heard the heavy click of the door handle. My heart leaped into my throat. The pain momentarily faded into the background. I turned my head, forcing my heavy, sweat-drenched eyelids to open. I expected to see the doctor in his scrubs, ready to guide me through the final stages of labor. Or maybe, just maybe, Marcus had finally arrived. Maybe he was rushing in, still in his custom-tailored suit, breathless and full of frantic apologies. The heavy oak door swung open slowly. The bright fluorescent light from the hallway spilled into my dim, quiet room. It was Marcus. He was standing there in the doorway wearing his custom navy blue suit, looking as perfectly groomed as ever. Not a single hair was out of place, but he was not rushing. He was not apologizing, and his eyes held no warmth, no panic for my well-being. My relief instantly turned into a sickening knot of confusion as my gaze drifted downward. Marcus was not carrying flowers or an overnight bag. His right hand was tightly intertwined with the hand of another woman. It was Chloe, his 23-year-old administrative assistant, the girl who always wore skirts a little too short and smiled a little too wide whenever I visited his office. She was standing slightly behind him, clinging to his arm as if he were her lifeline. She was wearing an oversized designer hoodie, her makeup perfectly done despite the situation. But what truly paralyzed me was the performance she was putting on. Chloe was practically hyperventilating, burying her face into Marcus's shoulder, sobbing loudly with forced theatrical tears. I could not process what I was seeing. The room began to spin. Was this a hallucination brought on by the sheer trauma of the pain? I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the image remained. Marcus and Chloe, my husband and his assistant in my delivery room. The beeping of the fetal heart monitor seemed to accelerate, matching the sudden erratic hammering of my own heart against my ribs. Marcus took a step forward, pulling a whimpering Chloe along with him. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask about the baby. He did not even look at the monitors displaying his daughter's heartbeat. His jaw was set tight, and his gaze was entirely devoid of any affection. It was the look he gave people during hostile corporate takeovers, a look of total detachment. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic wail, burying her face deeper into his expensive suit jacket. She was acting as though she were the one enduring the excruciating pain of childbirth, not me. Her fake sobs echoed off the pristine walls of the VIP suite, a grotesque contrast to the quiet dignity I had maintained for the past 6 hours. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the pitcher of ice water sitting on the tray table directly at their heads. But my body was paralyzed by another massive contraction, forcing me to bite down on a scream as the ultimate betrayal unfolded right before my eyes. When the contraction finally passed, leaving me gasping for air against the damp pillows, Marcus did not rush to my side. He did not ask the nurse for a cool washcloth. He did not even ask if the baby was okay. Instead, he cleared his throat, adjusted his perfectly knotted silk tie, and turned his attention entirely to Nurse Sarah, who was standing frozen in the corner of the room. "Excuse me," Nurse Marcus said, his voice dripping with that familiar, polished authority he usually reserved for his boardroom meetings. "We're going to need you to transfer my wife to a standard delivery room immediately. Pack up her belongings. Chloe needs to lie down. She is under an immense amount of stress and her blood pressure is spiking." Sarah blinked her eyes, darting between me, Marcus, and the sobbing girl clinging to his arm. "Sir, I don't understand. Your wife is fully dilated. She is in active labor. This is her reserved suite." "And I am the one paying for it," Marcus snapped, stepping fully into the harsh hospital light. "Look at Chloe. She's extremely fragile right now. Her doctor said any emotional distress could put the baby at risk. She is carrying my son, the firstborn son of the family, the heir to my father's investment fund. She requires a calm, premium environment." He said it so casually, my son. The words hung in the cold air like toxic smoke. He was announcing his infidelity, his secret life, and his twisted priorities in the exact same breath. He was completely unbothered by the fact that the woman he had been married to for 5 years was currently bleeding and contracting on a hospital bed right in front of him. Chloe peeked out from behind his shoulder, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. "I'm so sorry, Nia," she whined, her voice pitched artificially high to sound innocent. "I really didn't want to do this tonight, but my anxiety is just so bad." And Marcus is right. A boy is so important to his family's legacy. You know how Vivian is about the family name. I just need to lie in the soaking tub and calm down. I hope you understand." The audacity was blinding. I stared at them, the intense physical pain of labor momentarily eclipsed by the sheer, unadulterated disrespect being hurled in my face. Marcus finally looked at me. His expression was completely void of guilt or shame. If anything, he looked annoyed that I was taking up space. "Don't make a scene, Naya," he warned, his tone patronizing and icy. "You are having a girl." "It's fine, but you know as well as I do that a daughter doesn't carry the same weight in my family. My mother has been very clear about the succession line for the firm. Chloe is carrying the boy. She needs the VIP amenities to manage her high-risk state. You grew up sharing a single bathroom with 3 siblings in a cramped apartment. You're tough. You're used to roughing it. A standard room will not kill you." I felt the blood roaring in my ears. He was using my working-class background against me. He was taking the very resilience he once claimed to admire and turning it into a weapon. He was standing there, a wealthy, privileged man who had never faced a real hardship in his entire life, telling me that because I had survived poverty, I deserved to be treated like garbage during the birth of our child. He was telling me that our daughter, the baby, currently fighting her way into this world, was essentially a second-class citizen in his eyes simply because she was female. Nurse Sarah finally found her voice, stepping between Marcus and my bed. "Sir, I cannot authorize a room transfer for a patient in active labor. It is a massive medical liability, and frankly, it is incredibly cruel." "I don't care about your authorization," Marcus sneered. He pulled his platinum credit card from his leather wallet and tossed it onto the tray table next to my bed. "Call the hospital administrator. Tell them Marcus Vance is demanding a room reassignment. I donate $50,000 a year to this hospital's charity gala. I expect premium service for the mother of my son. Move her now." Chloe let out another exaggerated whimper, leaning heavily against Marcus and rubbing her completely flat stomach under the oversized hoodie. "My stomach hurts, baby," she cooed. "Please just make them give me the bed. The lighting in the hallway is giving me a severe migraine." Bon zakada. I watched them, the cheating husband and his entitled mistress. I watched him rub her back, offering her the tenderness, validation, and protection he had completely withdrawn from me. For 5 years, I had endured the microaggressions from his family. I had sat quietly through elite dinner parties while his mother Vivian made passive-aggressive comments about my public school education. I had tolerated his sister Jada's snide remarks about my hair, my clothes, and my supposed lack of pedigree. I had swallowed it all, believing that Marcus and I were a team, that our love was a solid shield against their elitist toxicity. But this was the ultimate revelation. Marcus was not protecting me from his family. He was exactly like them. He viewed me not as an equal partner, but as a stepping stone he had outgrown. And now that he had found a younger, more compliant woman who was supposedly giving him the male heir his fragile ego desperately required, I was completely disposable. The rage building inside me was volcanic. It was a dark, consuming fire that demanded I rip the IV from my arm, lunge across the room, and tear the custom suit right off his back. I wanted to scream until my throat bled. I wanted to shatter the crystal water pitcher against the wall. I wanted to make them feel a fraction of the agony that was currently tearing my body apart from the inside out. I could practically feel the heavy anticipation in the room. Nurse Sarah was bracing for the explosion. They were waiting for the hysterical, screaming wife. They were waiting for me to break down and beg for my dignity. But as another massive contraction began to build at the base of my spine, wrapping around my stomach like an iron band, a profound and terrifying clarity washed over me. If I screamed, I would be the crazy, hormonal, jealous wife. If I fought him right now, I would be putting my daughter's safe delivery at risk by elevating my heart rate. And more importantly, if I reacted with explosive rage, I would be showing Marcus my cards. I would be letting him know exactly how deeply he had wounded me. Marcus did not know that the $50,000 he donated to this hospital was absolute pocket change compared to the silent investments I had made over the last 3 years. He did not know that the platinum credit card he just threw on the table was tied to an account I had already begun monitoring for corporate fraud. He thought I was just a terrified, dependent wife from the wrong side of the tracks who would cry and plead for his attention. I took a deep, shuddering breath, locking my eyes entirely on his. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick, and suffocating. Nurse Sarah looked at me, her eyes pleading for me to fight back, her hand hovering near the emergency call button, ready to summon security and have them thrown out. Chloe stopped faking her tears, suddenly unnerved by my complete lack of reaction. Marcus shifted his weight, his arrogant facade slipping just a fraction as he waited for my inevitable breakdown. But the breakdown never came. Instead, I waited for the peak of the contraction to ebb, focusing entirely on the slow, deliberate release of my breath. I uncurled my fingers from the cold metal bed rails. I did not look at Chloe. I did not look at this platinum credit card, glinting offensively under the harsh hospital lights. I looked solely at Marcus. "Give her the room," I said. My voice was not shaking. It was not thick with tears. It was completely flat, an eerie, hollow sound that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen right out of the air. Nurse Sarah stared at me, her mouth slightly open in protest. "Nia, you don't have to do this," she whispered, stepping closer to my bed. "Medical protocol dictates that we prioritize the patient in active labor. I can have security escort them out right now. Just say the word." I shook my head slowly, never breaking eye contact with my soon-to-be ex-husband. I said, "Give her the room, Sarah. If the father of my child believes his assistant requires a soaking tub more than his wife does, then let them have it. I will not share a space with a man who carries the stench of betrayal." Marcus narrowed his eyes. For a split second, I saw a flicker of unease cross his perfectly manicured features. He had come geared up for a massive screaming match. He had braced himself for tears, for begging for the chaotic emotional display he always associated with women. My absolute compliance threw him off balance, but his monumental ego quickly paved over his confusion. He let out a dismissive scoff, wrapping his arm tighter around Chloe. "See that you hurry up," Marcus said to the nurse, completely ignoring my insult. "Chloe needs to lie down immediately and make sure housekeeping changes those sheets." Chloe peeked out from behind his expensive lapel, offering me a tight, victorious little smile. It was the smile of the girl who thought she had just conquered the world. She thought she had won the ultimate prize, a wealthy man, a luxury hospital suite, and a guaranteed spot in the affluent Vance family. She had no idea she had just boldly claimed a front-row seat on the Titanic, and I was the one holding the iceberg. "Thank you, Nia," Chloe whispered, her fake crying miraculously vanishing. "You are being so reasonable about this. I know it's hard, but it's what's best for the family." I did not grace her with a response. Slowly, agonizingly, I pushed myself up from the mattress. The physical pain of the labor was still tearing through my body, but it was now heavily insulated by a freezing, calculated rage. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. Nurse Sarah immediately rushed forward, wrapping a supportive arm around my waist, glaring daggers at Marcus as she helped me stand. My hospital gown clung to my sweating skin. Every step felt like walking on broken glass, but I refused to ask for a wheelchair. I refused to let Marcus see me crumble. I leaned heavily on Sarah, gripping my small overnight bag in my free hand. As I shuffled towards the door, I passed within inches of Marcus and his mistress. I did not shrink away. I stopped tilting my head just slightly to look at him one last time as his wife. He looked back, his expression a mask of cold impatience, waiting for me to clear the doorway so he could claim his stolen throne. "Enjoy the suite, Marcus," I said softly, the words sliding off my tongue like smooth ice. "Make sure you get comfortable." I did not wait for his reply. I turned and walked out into the brightly lit hallway. Every step I took away from that VIP suite was a step toward my liberation. The walk to the standard maternity ward was a blur of fluorescent lights passing medical carts and the squeaking of rubber soles on linoleum floors. My body screamed in protest with every inch I moved. The contractions were coming faster now, leaving me breathless and dizzy. But I kept my head high. I refused to stumble. I refused to let anyone see me as the tragic victim of a cheating husband. Sarah guided me into a cramped, sterile room at the far end of the corridor. It was a fraction of the size of the VIP suite. The walls were painted a dull, lifeless beige. There was no soaking tub. There was no panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. There was only a narrow mechanical bed, a single plastic guest chair that looked like it belonged in a cheap motel, and a standard heart monitor. It was the exact type of room Marcus's elitist mother Vivian would turn her nose up at. It was the type of room they believed I belonged in, but as Sarah helped me onto the stiff, unforgiving mattress, I felt an overwhelming sense of power. I was no longer breathing the same air as the man who had just destroyed our family. I was alone, yes, but I was also entirely free to execute my next moves without his watchful, arrogant eyes monitoring my every reaction. I did not have to pretend to be the beautiful, supportive wife anymore. The masquerade was finally over. Sarah busied herself checking my vitals, her hands shaking with suppressed anger. "I cannot believe you let him do that," she muttered, adjusting the blood pressure cuff on my arm. "I have been a labor and delivery nurse for 15 years, and I have never seen anything so utterly vile. You should have let me call security. Nia, you have rights." I looked at the ceiling, my breathing shallow as another contraction began to build in my lower back. "I know I have rights, Sarah," I whispered, gripping the scratchy hospital blanket. "But sometimes you have to give your enemies exactly what they want, so they don't realize they're walking straight into a trap." She paused, looking at me, with a mixture of confusion and deep concern. I closed my eyes, letting the pain wash over me, converting every ounce of that physical agony into pure, unadulterated focus. Marcus thought he had just asserted his dominance. He thought he had put me in my place, reminding me that I was nothing without his name and his money. But as I lay in that cramped, dimly lit room preparing to push my daughter into the world, my mind was running through the meticulously gathered files on my encrypted hard drive. For the past 8 months, I had been working as a confidential whistleblower for the Securities and Exchange Commission. I had systematically documented every single illegal wire transfer, every forged signature, and every offshore shell company Marcus and his brother-in-law Brad had created. They had been laundering millions of dollars from their high-net-worth clients, siphoning the money through fake vendor accounts they had set up using my name. They thought I was just a naive wife who happily signed whatever complicated tax documents they put in front of me. They thought I was the perfect, uneducated scapegoat from the wrong side of town who would blindly trust her sophisticated husband and his corporate lawyer brother-in-law. They did not know that the quiet, compliant woman they had been mocking for 5 years was the anonymous founder and CEO of a highly successful luxury maternity brand. They did not know I understood corporate finance better than they did, and they certainly did not know I had already handed their entire criminal enterprise over to the federal government. A searing pain ripped through my core, forcing a loud, guttural groan from my throat. It was time. My baby was coming. Sarah hit the call button, shouting for the doctor, her voice frantic as she coached my breathing. I gripped the side rails of the tiny bed, pushing with everything I had left in me. I was not just pushing to bring my daughter into the world. I was pushing away the last remaining ties to the Vance family. I was violently expelling the weakness, the compromise, and the silent suffering I had endured for half a decade. As the doctor rushed into the room, snapping on his gloves, I let out one final earth-shattering push. And then the most beautiful sound filled that cramped, sterile room, the sharp, healthy cry of my newborn daughter. Sarah laid her wet, warm body onto my chest. I wrapped my arms around her, burying my face into her tiny neck, breathing in the scent of pure, untainted life. Tears finally streamed down my face, but they were not tears of heartbreak or defeat. They were tears of absolute triumph. "You are safe, my sweet girl," I whispered into her ear, fiercely kissing her forehead. "Mommy has you, and by tomorrow morning, nobody will ever be able to look down on us again." While Marcus and Chloe were sleeping soundly in the luxurious bed they had stolen from me, unaware of the storm gathering on their horizon, I held my daughter in the dark. I was exhausted, bleeding and bruised, but my eyes were wide open, staring at the blank hospital wall with the deadly focus of an apex predator waiting for the sun to rise. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for the vultures to land. The morning sun broke through the small, high window of my cramped recovery room, casting a harsh yellow light across the linoleum floor. I had not slept a single wink. My body ached with a dull, throbbing intensity, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me wide awake. My beautiful baby girl was swaddled in a scratchy hospital blanket, sleeping peacefully against my chest. Her tiny chest rose and fell in a perfect, soothing rhythm. I traced the delicate curve of her cheek, making a silent promise that she would never know the kind of toxic manipulation I had endured. Around 9 a.m., the distinct sound of heavy footsteps and loud, self-important voices echoed down the corridor. You can always hear the Vance family before you see them. They moved through the world with an arrogance that demanded everyone else step aside. I recognized my mother-in-law Vivian's sharp, commanding voice instantly. She was complaining about the hospital parking, her heels clicking aggressively against the floor. Then came my sister-in-law Jada, her voice a pitch too high, agreeing with whatever Vivian said. And underneath it all was the deep, condescending chuckle of Brad, my white brother-in-law, who always acted like he owned whatever room he walked into. My door was cracked open just a few inches. Through the narrow gap, I watched the parade of designer coats and extravagant floral arrangements march past. Vivian was holding a massive bouquet of blue hydrangeas and a silver gift bag from a high-end boutique. Jada was carrying a ridiculous tower of blue balloons. They walked directly past room 314, my room, the room where the wife of 5 years had just delivered a child. They did not even break their stride. They did not pause to peek inside. They did not ask a single nurse where Nia was. I was entirely invisible to them. A few moments later, I heard the heavy oak door of the VIP suite swing open down the hall. The resulting chorus of cheers and exaggerated cooing made my stomach turn. "Oh my goodness, look at our precious boy!" Vivian practically shrieked. Her voice, usually so measured and critical, was dripping with absolute adoration. I heard Marcus laugh, a proud, booming sound that he had never once directed toward me. He was playing the part of the triumphant patriarch. And then there was Chloe laying it on thick with a weak, breathy voice, thanking them for coming, telling them how hard the night had been for her and her little prince. I lay there in the silence of my sterile room, forced to listen to the grotesque celebration of my own betrayal. The acoustics of the maternity ward carried every word down the hall with agonizing clarity. I heard Brad slap Marcus on the back. "Well done, Marcus." Brad said, his voice loud enough to wake the dead. "A boy, finally. We were getting worried you were going to leave the Vance legacy to a girl. We need a strong heir for the investment fund, not some emotional liability." Vivian immediately chimed in, her tone dismissive and cold. "Well, thank goodness Chloe understands the importance of succession, unlike some people who think a last name is just a meal ticket." The entire room erupted into polite, calculated laughter. They were laughing at me while I lay bleeding 50 feet away, holding a child that shared their bloodline. They were treating my existence like a failed experiment they had finally managed to clean up. I remembered the first time Vivian invited me to her country club. She had introduced me to her friends as her son's little charity project. She constantly reminded me that growing up on the south side of Atlanta meant I lacked the pedigree to truly understand wealth management. She pushed Marcus to keep our finances separate, convinced I was a gold digger waiting to drain his trust fund. What she did not know was that my e-commerce company was quietly generating triple the revenue of their outdated investment firm. I had hidden my success perfectly, letting them believe their narrative of superiority because it kept them blind to my actual power. And then there was Brad. Brad, the Ivy League lawyer who loved to talk down to me at every family gathering. He loved using legal jargon to make me feel small. He was the architect of the family's offshore accounts, the man who thought he was untouchable. Listening to his loud, arrogant laughter echoing down the hallway, I felt a deep sense of anticipation. Brad thought he had outsmarted the system by putting the shell companies under my name. He thought a black woman with a public school education would never understand the complex tax documents he slipped into my yearly paperwork. He was about to learn a very hard lesson about underestimating the people you exploit. The sheer cruelty of it was breathtaking. Any normal woman would have been crushed. Any normal woman would have buried her face in a pillow and sobbed until she could not breathe. And for a fleeting second, a sharp pang of grief did hit me, not for the loss of Marcus, but for the family I thought I had married into. I remembered the Thanksgiving dinners, the forced smiles, the way I had bent over backwards to learn their traditions, their favorite recipes, their elitist rules of etiquette. I had starved parts of my own soul trying to fit into their rigid, prejudiced mold. And this was my reward, total erasure. I looked down at my daughter. She stirred in her sleep, her tiny fingers curling tightly around the edge of my gown. She did not need their conditional love. She did not need a grandmother who weighed human value based on gender and tax brackets. She did not need an uncle who viewed women as emotional liabilities. She had me. And I was about to show them exactly what an emotional liability could do to their precious legacy. The contrast between the two rooms was staggering. Down the hall there was warmth, expensive flowers, blue balloons, and the joyous clinking of glasses. In my room, there was only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the quiet breathing of my newborn. Nurse Sarah came in to check my vitals. She took one look at my face, then glanced toward the open door where the noise was coming from. Her jaw tightened. She walked over and quietly closed my door, shutting out the worst of the noise. "I am so sorry," Sarah whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears of second-hand anger. "I have never seen a family act like this. I can call the administrator to have them quiet down." I shook my head, offering her a faint, knowing smile. "Let them celebrate Sarah. Let them have their morning because it's the last good morning they are ever going to have." The celebration down the hall continued for over an hour. I heard the popping of a champagne cork, a clear violation of hospital policy. But of course the Vance family believed rules were only suggestions for people beneath their tax bracket. I listened as they discussed the trust they were going to set up for Chloe's baby. I listened as they planned a lavish baby shower at the country club. They were completely rewriting their family history, seamlessly slotting a 23-year-old mistress into my place without a single ounce of hesitation. The ultimate isolation was a gift. It stripped away any lingering doubt I had about what I needed to do. If they had shown even a fraction of empathy, if Vivian had poked her head in to check on her granddaughter, I might have felt a twinge of guilt about the federal trap I was about to spring on them. But their blatant disregard erased every last drop of mercy in my heart. They had made their choice. They had drawn the battle lines. They wanted to cast me out into the cold. I took a deep breath, the sterile hospital air filling my lungs. The sun was fully up now. The morning was bitter cold and undeniably clear. The waiting was almost over. Just as that thought crossed my mind, the heavy wooden door to my room swung open without a single knock. No polite inquiry to see if I was decent. No gentle knock to avoid waking a sleeping infant. Vivian stepped over the threshold like a military general surveying a newly conquered territory. She was dressed impeccably, wearing a tailored cream-colored Chanel suit that likely cost more than the entire medical bill for my delivery. Her hair was perfectly sprayed into an unmovable helmet of generational wealth, and the heavy, expensive scent of her designer perfume immediately choked the sterile hospital air. She did not look in the plastic bassinet beside my bed. She did not look at the tiny, swaddled bundle resting peacefully against my chest. Her eyes, cold and aggressively calculating, locked directly onto mine. For a woman who spent every Sunday morning sitting in the front pew of Atlanta's most exclusive megachurch, claiming to value family and faith above all else, she was completely indifferent to the fact that her own flesh-and-blood granddaughter was breathing softly just 2 feet away. To Vivian, the child in my arms was not family. She was an inconvenience, a mistake that needed to be erased. Without offering a single word of greeting, Vivian marched straight to the foot of my cramped hospital bed. She aggressively unclasped her designer handbag, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in a heavy dark blue folder, and tossed it onto my blankets. The heavy thud of the paper hitting my legs made me flinch slightly, but I quickly composed my face, tightening my grip on my daughter. "I am not going to waste time with pleasantries, Naya," she said, her voice sharp, precise, and dripping with condescension. "You know exactly what that is. Marcus has retained the best divorce attorneys in the state. The papers have been drafted expedited and are ready for your signature right now. I suggest you find a pen immediately." I looked down at the blue folder lying on the scratchy hospital blanket, feeling a strange, absolute calm wash over me. This was it. The mask was entirely off. I looked back up at her, keeping my voice perfectly level and quiet, so I would not wake the baby. "You are evicting me from the family before I have even been officially discharged from the maternity ward, Vivian. That's incredibly efficient even for you." Vivian let out a dry, humorless laugh that did not reach her eyes. "Don't play the tragic victim with me. We both knew this day was coming from the moment Marcus brought you to my house 5 years ago. You never fit in. You tried your absolute best to play dress-up, buying the right clothes and learning the right table manners. But you can never wash off the South Side. You don't have the pedigree. She began to pace at the foot of my bed, launching into a vile monologue, drenched in the toxic respectability politics she worshipped. "My son is a Vance," she declared, her chin tilted high. "He is the managing director of a legacy investment fund. He needs a wife who understands the social obligations of our elite circle. A wife who knows how to host a charity gala without needing a crash course in basic etiquette. He needs a woman whose family background actually brings value to our brand. And more importantly, he needs an heir." She stopped pacing and pointed a manicured finger toward the hallway, gesturing in the direction of the VIP suite. "Chloe is young, yes. She lacks polish, but she is adaptable. She comes from a respectable suburban family, not some cramped apartment, and she is giving this family a son. You gave us a girl who will eventually marry and lose the Vance name anyway. You have served your purpose, Nia. You proved that Marcus was charitable enough to try and elevate someone from your background, but the charity experiment is officially over. It is time for you to pack up and go back to wherever it is people like you belong." The sheer concentrated venom in her words was astounding. She was reducing my humanity, my 5 years of absolute loyalty to her son and the life of my newborn daughter to nothing more than a failed social experiment. She genuinely believed that because I did not come from generational wealth, I was intellectually and morally inferior. She thought her money and her country club memberships gave her the supreme right to dictate my worth. "What if I refused to sign it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, keeping my expression entirely blank. "What if I decide to take Marcus to court and fight for half of everything he built during our marriage?" Vivian took a sudden step closer, her eyes flashing with absolute malice. She leaned over the foot of the bed, invading my personal space, her voice dropping to a menacing theatrical hiss. "You will not fight him because you have absolutely nothing to fight with. My son-in-law Brad has already secured the family assets. Your joint accounts were frozen at midnight last night. Your credit cards will be declined by lunchtime today. You do not have the capital to hire a paralegal, let alone a corporate law firm capable of going up against our people." She reached out and forcefully tapped her perfectly polished nail against the thick stack of divorce papers on my lap. "I am offering you a small, generous severance package in those pages, because I don't want the public relations nightmare of my son's ex-wife ending up in a homeless shelter. Take the deal. Sign it before you don't even have a dime left to buy formula for this little girl." There it was, the ultimate unforgivable threat. She was using my child's basic survival as leverage to force me into submission. She thought she had me completely backed into a corner, completely financially dependent on their reluctant charity. It was the classic brutal tactic of the wealthy elite, trying to crush anyone they deemed a peasant, starve them out until they get on their knees and submit. I looked down at the divorce papers again. If I were the helpless, uneducated woman Vivian desperately needed me to be, I would be sobbing uncontrollably right now. I would be begging her for mercy, pleading for a few thousand just to keep the lights on in a tiny apartment somewhere. But I was not that woman. The severance package she was threatening me with was likely less than what my e-commerce company generated in a single Tuesday afternoon. I reached out and rested my hand flat on top of the blue folder. I did not open it. I just traced the edge of the thick paper, looking up at her with a chilling serenity. "You are very confident in Brad's legal maneuvering, Vivian. You really trust him to handle all of the family's money and secure those accounts." Vivian stood up straight, proudly brushing an invisible piece of lint off her Chanel jacket. "Brad is brilliant. He went to Harvard Law. He understands exactly how to protect wealth from people who try to leech off of it. He has ensured that every single dollar Marcus earned is completely untouchable by you. So stop stalling. I want that signature before I go back down the hall to celebrate the birth of my actual grandchild." I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her slightly uncomfortable. I picked up the folder and placed it gently on the tray table next to my bed. "I will look it over," I said quietly. Vivian sneered, clearly annoyed that I had not immediately burst into tears and begged for a pen. "Don't take too long. My patience is wearing incredibly thin, and my son has a real family to tend to." With that, she spun on her heel and marched out of the cramped room, leaving the door wide open behind her to ensure I could hear the laughter echoing from the VIP suite. She walked away feeling like an absolute conqueror. She had no idea she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to completely destroy her. Vivian's footsteps had barely faded down the corridor when a new, heavier shadow fell across the doorway of my cramped hospital room. I did not even need to look up to know who it was. The deliberate, heavy thud of expensive Italian leather loafers belonged to only one person in the Vance family, Brad Jada's husband, the brilliant Ivy League-educated corporate attorney who loved nothing more than reminding everyone else in the room exactly how smart he was. He did not knock. He simply stepped into the room, pushing the door halfway shut behind him to muffle the sounds of the celebration still echoing from the VIP suite. Brad leaned casually against the beige hospital wall, crossing his arms over his tailored gray suit. He looked completely out of place in the sterile maternity ward, exuding the kind of arrogant, untouchable privilege that only a wealthy white man navigating an affluent black family could possess. He thrived on being their legal savior, the architect of their generational wealth, and he wielded that power like a loaded weapon. He let out a slow, patronizing sigh, looking at me with an expression of exaggerated pity. "Well, Nia," he began, his voice smooth and dripping with artificial sympathy. "Vivian can be a bit blunt, but she's not wrong. I highly recommend you sign that paperwork before the close of business today. It really is the best possible outcome for someone in your precarious position." I kept my arms securely wrapped around my daughter, refusing to let his physical presence intimidate me. "I did not ask for your legal counsel, Brad." He chuckled a low, grating sound that vibrated with supreme overconfidence. He pushed off the wall and took a few steps closer to the bed, his eyes scanning the cheap plastic bassinet and the stark, depressing room. "That's your first mistake," he said, slipping his hands into his trouser pockets. "You always thought you could operate on our level without our guidance. But let's be brutally honest here. You don't understand how wealth works. You think because you married Marcus, you automatically gained a seat at the adult table. But wealth isn't just about having money in a checking account. It's about structure. It's about legal protection. And I am the one who built the fortress around the Vance family assets." I looked down at the blue folder still resting on my tray table, then back up at him. "Vivian said you froze my accounts. You and I both know that's illegal. Those were joint marital assets. The bank requires dual authorization for any transfer over $10,000. Brad smiled. It was a wide, predatory smile that showed far too many perfectly whitened teeth. It was the smile of a man who believed he was explaining basic addition to a slow toddler. "Oh, Nia, sweetheart, you really should not try to use legal terms you learned from watching television shows. It makes you look desperate." He took another step forward, lowering his voice into a condescending whisper. "Did you really think I would leave a loophole for an uneducated girl from the South Side to exploit? I am the managing partner of my firm. I draft contracts that make federal regulators dizzy." He was taking the bait. His monumental ego simply could not resist the opportunity to boast about his own perceived genius. I shifted slightly on the bed, clutching my baby closer, forcing my voice to tremble just enough to make him believe I was terrified. "How did you do it, Brad? How did you take my money without my signature?" He practically beamed with pride. "It was almost too easy," he bragged, pacing slowly at the foot of my bed. "When Marcus first married you, I knew you were an emotional liability. Women from your specific socioeconomic background tend to get loud and hostile when things don't go their way. I had to protect the fund. So 3 years ago, when you signed that massive stack of tax documents I brought over to your house, you weren't just signing your tax returns." He paused for dramatic effect, clearly relishing my stunned silence. "You also signed a broad power of attorney granting me complete executive control over the joint holding company. I didn't even have to forge your signature, Nia. You handed me the keys to the kingdom because you were too intimidated by the legal jargon to read page 42. Last night, the moment Marcus told me he was moving Chloe into the VIP suite and ending the marriage, I triggered a dissolution clause. I legally drained every single joint account and transferred the capital into an offshore trust under Vivian's name. By the time you woke up this morning, your net worth had been officially reduced to 0. I stared at him, letting my mouth fall open slightly, playing the part of the shattered, defeated wife to absolute perfection. I needed him to keep talking. I needed him to explicitly detail his crimes in his own arrogant words. But the power of attorney was only for the real estate investments, I stammered, making my voice sound weak and confused. You could not have moved the liquid cash. The bank would have flagged it. Brad rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by my persistence. Don't argue with me, Nia. It's embarrassing. I am the lawyer for the fund. I have personal relationships with the branch managers. When I tell them a transfer is authorized, they push it through without asking questions. I bypass the dual authorization by classifying the transfer as an emergency corporate restructuring. It's a gray area, sure, but by the time a judge ever gets around to subpoenaing those records, the money will be washed through 3 different shell companies in the Cayman Islands. You will be bankrupt long before you ever see the inside of a courtroom. He leaned heavily over the footboard of my bed, invading my space, his blue eyes locking onto mine with absolute malice. He wanted me to feel tiny. He wanted me to feel the crushing weight of his systemic power. He wanted to remind me that as a wealthy white man in America, the rules simply did not apply to him. Listen to me very carefully, he said, his tone dropping the fake sympathy and revealing the raw, ugly prejudice underneath. You are completely out of your depth. You do not have the resources, the education, or the social capital to fight us. If you try to make a scene, if you try to get aggressive and drag Marcus through a messy public divorce, I will personally ensure that you are buried in so much litigation that you will never see the light of day. I will tie you up in family court until you cannot even afford to feed that kid you are holding. Let the adults handle the finances, Naya. You just focus on signing your name where I tell you to. He reached out and tapped the blue folder with the back of his hand. Take the severance package, sign the papers, walk away quietly, and maybe I will let you keep the leased car so you can drive yourself back to whatever miserable neighborhood you crawled out of. Don't try to be the angry black woman fighting a system she doesn't understand. It never ends well. I did not blink. I did not look away. I simply absorbed every single vile, incriminating word he had just voluntarily confessed to. He had just admitted to financial fraud, wire fraud, and abusing a power of attorney to embezzle marital assets. He had just handed me a golden confession on a silver platter, completely unaware that his own hubris was the very weapon I was going to use to destroy his entire life. I am not signing anything right now, Brad, I said quietly, keeping my face entirely devoid of emotion. Brad let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He stood up straight, adjusting his expensive tie, looking at me like I was a stubborn insect he was about to step on. Suit yourself, but remember this conversation when your credit cards start declining at the grocery store. I am the fund's lawyer. You cannot beat me, sweetheart. Know your place. With that final sickening piece of advice, he turned his back on me and walked out of the room, leaving the door ajar just like Vivian had. He walked back down the hallway toward the VIP suite, ready to drink champagne and celebrate his brilliant legal victory. He thought he had just delivered the final fatal blow to a helpless woman. He had absolutely no idea that he had just signed his own federal arrest warrant. Wait, Brad, please. The words tore from my throat, deliberately pitched, to sound frantic and entirely broken. He had just stepped over the threshold, his hand still resting on the heavy wooden door handle. I knew a man with a God complex like Brad could never resist the sweet sound of total surrender. He paused, his broad shoulders dropping into a relaxed, victorious posture before he slowly turned back around. He leaned against the doorframe, raising one perfectly groomed eyebrow, waiting for me to beg. I forced my hands to tremble visibly against the scratchy hospital blanket. I pulled my daughter closer to my chest, widening my eyes to project the image of a terrified, cornered animal. You said you used the power of attorney to drain our joint accounts, I stammered, letting my breath hitch artificially. But there wasn't that much liquid cash left in our personal accounts. Marcus just bought that new sports car last month to fund an offshore trust in the Cayman Islands that generates the kind of interest you are talking about. You would need millions. Where did the rest of the capital come from? You moved your client's money, didn't you? Brad let out a heavy theatrical sigh, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a particularly slow child. He took 2 steps back into my cramped room, completely unable to pass up the opportunity to flaunt his own criminal genius. He thrived on feeling superior, and my feigned panic was the exact fuel his ego required. "You really should stop trying to do the math, Nia," he said, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. "It is going to give you a headache. But since you are so morbidly curious about how the adults handle high-level finance, I will humor you. You are right. Your little joint checking account was pennies. It was barely enough to cover the private jet fees for Vivian last year. The real capital came from the Vance Family Investment Fund. On attend ici distant. I gasped softly, playing my part to absolute perfection. "But that is illegal," I whispered, shrinking back against the hospital pillows. "That is embezzlement. If the federal regulators audit Vivian's new offshore account and see client funds mixed with our marital assets, she could go to federal prison. You could all go to prison." Brad threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming sound that bounced off the stark beige walls of my room. It was the laugh of a man who firmly believed he was entirely untouchable by the laws that governed regular people. "Nobody is going to prison, sweetheart," he sneered, stepping closer to the bed and pointing a finger at me, "because my fingerprints are not on a single document. Do you remember that interior design consulting firm you wanted to start 3 years ago? The one Marcus told you was a silly little hobby, but helped you set up the LLC for anyway." My blood ran ice cold, but not from fear. It was the cold, sharp thrill of absolute victory. I knew exactly what he was about to say. I just needed him to say it out loud. I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes wide and fearful. Brad smiled, showing his teeth again. "I took your little LLC and I repurposed it. I created 3 dummy vendor accounts under your company name. For the past 36 months, Marcus and I have been systematically overbilling our highest net worth clients for phantom consulting services. We funneled the excess capital directly into the holding company that bears your name and your social security number. We washed over $12 million through your silly little hobby business." He leaned in close, his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of hospital antiseptic. "And last night, when I triggered the dissolution of your assets, I transferred all $12 million into an untraceable offshore trust. So yes, the fund is missing money. But the paper trail doesn't lead to me. It doesn't lead to Marcus. It leads directly to you." He stood up straight, brushing his hands together as if he were dusting off dirt. "If the Securities and Exchange Commission ever comes knocking, and they won't, because I am too good at my job, all they will find is a bitter, financially unstable ex-wife who embezzled money from her husband's family fund to support her lavish lifestyle. You are the fall guy, Nia. You have been the fall guy since the day Marcus put a ring on your finger." Kineki-sai. The silence in the room was absolute. Down the hall, I could hear the faint sound of Chloe laughing in the VIP suite, entirely unaware of the massive federal crime ring she had just married into. Brad watched me closely, waiting for the devastating reality of his words to crush me. He expected me to dissolve into a puddle of hysterical tears. He expected me to reach out and grab the divorce papers, desperate to sign away my rights, just to avoid a fabricated prison sentence. "So, you see," Brad concluded, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper, "you don't have a choice. You sign the divorce settlement. You take the tiny severance package Vivian offered, and you keep your mouth completely shut. In exchange, I will make sure the dummy corporations are quietly dissolved and you get to stay out of a federal penitentiary. It is the most generous offer you are ever going to get in your entire life. Do we understand each other?" I looked at him. I looked at the sheer, unadulterated arrogance radiating from every pore of his body. He was so blinded by his own prejudice, so convinced of his own intellectual supremacy, that he never bothered to look beneath the surface. He never bothered to check if the woman he was framing was actually the naive victim he believed her to be. "I understand you perfectly, Brad," I said, my voice completely steady. "Good," he replied, giving his suit jacket one final tug. "I will expect those papers signed and handed to the front desk by noon. Don't make me come back here, Nia. I will not be nearly as polite the second time around." He turned on his heel and strode out of the room. I watched his shadow disappear down the hallway. I listened to the heavy, confident thud of his shoes until they faded completely into the ambient noise of the maternity ward. I waited another full 60 seconds just to be absolutely certain he was gone. The moment the hallway fell quiet, the trembling in my hands stopped instantly. The terrified, broken expression vanished from my face, replaced by a mask of cold, calculated precision. I gently shifted my sleeping daughter to one side, reaching with my free hand into the bottom compartment of my overnight bag. I pulled out a heavy, encrypted satellite phone that Marcus did not even know existed. I unlocked the screen and pressed a single speed dial button. The line rang twice before a deep, professional voice answered on the other end. "Agent Davis," the voice said. "It is Nia," I replied, my voice echoing quietly in the sterile room. "Are you safe?" he asked, his tone shifting into immediate operational readiness. "Did you get the delivery done without complications?" "I have my daughter and we are fine," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the open doorway. "But more importantly, I have the final piece of the puzzle. Brad just walked into my hospital room and voluntarily confessed to the entire wire fraud operation. He explicitly named the shell companies. He confirmed the exact amount of $12 million, and he admitted to using my LLC as a front to defraud their clients. The audio is crystal clear. It is already uploading to your secure server through the hidden microphone in my smartwatch." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of fingers flying across a computer keyboard. "I am seeing the audio file come through now," Agent Davis said, a hint of deep satisfaction in his voice. "This is the smoking gun, Nia. We have everything we need to bypass a grand jury and move straight to immediate asset seizure and arrest warrants." I looked over at the blue folder sitting on my tray table. The divorce papers that were supposed to be my financial death sentence. I reached over, picked up the entire stack of documents, and dropped them directly into the plastic trash can beside my bed. "They are in the VIP maternity suite at the end of the hall," I told him, my voice colder than ice. "They are drinking champagne and celebrating their new heir." "Understood," Agent Davis replied. "What is your call?" I took a deep breath, feeling the pain of the last 5 years finally begin to lift off my shoulders. "Pull the net," I said. I disconnected the call and dropped the heavy satellite phone back into the bottom of my bag. It was time. I stood up from the stiff hospital bed. My body still ached from the exhausting delivery, but the pure adrenaline surging through my veins completely masked the physical pain. I reached into my overnight bag and pulled out the emerald green silk robe I had packed months ago. I slipped it over my shoulders, letting the luxurious fabric cascade all the way down to my ankles. I was not going to walk into that room looking like a broken, discarded victim. I carefully picked up my sleeping daughter, wrapping her securely in a soft, cream-colored cashmere blanket. I took one last look at the dreary beige walls of room 314. I was never going to be pushed into a corner again. I stepped out into the brightly lit hallway. The maternity ward was bustling with nurses and doctors starting their morning rounds, but my focus was entirely fixed on the heavy double doors at the far end of the corridor, the VIP suite. As I walked, the sound of their celebration grew louder and more obnoxious. I could hear the distinct pop of another champagne bottle. I could hear Vivian loudly praising Chloe for securing the family bloodline, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I could hear Brad bragging about his latest golf game, completely unfazed by the multi-million-dollar federal crime he had just confessed to orchestrating. They were having the time of their lives, completely oblivious to the massive storm currently hurtling toward them at breakneck speed. I did not knock. I simply reached out and pushed the heavy oak doors wide open. The doors hit the wall with a loud, resounding thud that immediately silenced the entire room. The scene inside was exactly as grotesque as I had imagined. Chloe was propped up against a mountain of plush pillows, wearing a sheer designer nightgown, holding a crystal flute of non-alcoholic cider. Marcus was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding her hand and smiling like the proud patriarch he desperately wanted to be. Vivian and Jada were busy arranging massive bouquets of expensive blue hydrangeas on the windowsill. Brad was leaning casually against the mahogany wet bar, pouring himself another glass of vintage champagne. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. The music playing softly from a Bluetooth speaker seemed to fade into nothing. They just stared at me, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of my presence. I stood in the doorway, the vibrant emerald silk of my robe contrasting sharply with the sterile hospital environment, holding my daughter close to my chest. I did not look broken. I did not look terrified. I looked exactly like the woman who owned the ground they were standing on. Marcus was the first to break the silence. He dropped Chloe's hand and stood up, his face instantly twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "What is wrong with you?" he demanded, marching toward the center of the room. "Have you completely lost your mind? Get out of here right now." Vivian dropped a crystal vase onto the bedside table, water splashing everywhere. "How dare you show your face in this room?" she shrieked, her perfectly manicured facade instantly crumbling into pure hostility. "We gave you a direct order to sign those papers and leave quietly. You are trespassing on a private family celebration. You have absolutely no right to be here." Brad set his champagne glass down on the wet bar with a loud clink. He shook his head, looking at me with absolute disgust. "I warned you, Nia," he sneered, taking a menacing step forward. "I told you not to make a scene. You are just proving every single stereotype we ever had about you. You are acting like an emotional liability. Now turn around and walk back to your miserable little room before I call hospital security and have you physically dragged out of this building." Chloe immediately started her theatrical whimpering again, clutching the expensive hospital blankets to her chest. "Marcus, make her leave," she whined, forcing her voice to tremble violently. "She is scaring me. The stress is going to hurt the baby. Please get her away from me right now." They swarmed me. Marcus stepped so close I could feel the heat radiating off his angry body. His hand was raised, as if he were about to grab my arm and forcefully throw me out into the hallway. They were a pack of rabid wolves, desperate to protect their stolen territory and reassert their dominance over the woman they viewed as nothing more than a peasant. But I did not take a single step back. I did not flinch. I just looked at Marcus, then at Vivian, and finally at Brad. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a woman who knew she was holding the winning lottery ticket while everyone else in the room was standing on a landmine. Before Marcus could lay a single finger on my silk robe, a breathless, panicked voice echoed from the hallway right behind my shoulder. "Please step away from her immediately." The aggressive crowd parted slightly as Dr. Harrison, the chief administrative director of Atlanta Medical, practically shoved his way past Marcus. He was a tall, imposing man with graying hair who usually commanded absolute authority in these halls. He was the man the Vance family frequently bragged about playing tennis with at their country club. But right now, Dr. Harrison was sweating profusely. His expensive tie was crooked, and he was completely ignoring the wealthy Vance family. He turned his back squarely on Marcus and bowed his head slightly toward me. His posture radiated a level of pure, terrified subservience that sent a shockwave through the room. "Ms. Vance," Dr. Harrison gasped, trying desperately to catch his breath. "I am so incredibly sorry for this unacceptable disruption. I was just notified by the hospital's board of directors about the room reassignment from last night. It was a catastrophic failure of our internal protocol. The nurse on duty has already been suspended pending a full investigation. Please tell me you and your daughter are unharmed. Is there anything I can get you immediately?" Marcus stared at the hospital director, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. The arrogant fire in his eyes was suddenly replaced by sheer confusion. "What the hell are you talking about, Harrison?" Marcus snapped, trying to regain control of the narrative. "She is the one disrupting us. She is trespassing. I pay $50,000 a year to this hospital's charity fund. I am the one who demanded that room change. Have security remove her right now." Dr. Harrison finally turned around to face Marcus, but his expression held absolutely no warmth or familiarity. He looked at Marcus as if he were a completely insignificant nuisance. "I am afraid you are severely mistaken, Marcus," the director said, his voice dropping to a stern, authoritative tone. "You do not dictate protocol in this building, and you certainly do not have the authority to remove this woman from this suite." Marcus stepped back, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Excuse me," he sputtered, pointing a furious finger at the hospital director's chest. "Do you know who you are talking to? I am Marcus Vance. My family has been on the donor wall of this hospital for 3 generations. I demand you call security right now and have this crazy woman escorted off the premises before I pull every single cent of our funding." Dr. Harrison did not flinch. He did not cower the way people usually did when a Vance raised their voice. He simply straightened his tie, crossed his arms, and looked at Marcus with a mixture of absolute pity and profound disgust. "Your $50,000 annual pledge is certainly appreciated, Marcus. However, it barely covers the cost of the floral arrangements in our main lobby, and it certainly does not give you the right to disrespect the primary benefactor of this entire institution." Vivian stepped forward, her expensive heels crunching slightly on the floor. "Benefactor, what on earth are you talking about, Harrison?" "What on earth are—" "She is a nobody. She is my son's soon-to-be ex-wife. She doesn't even have a bank account right now." Dr. Harrison gestured respectfully toward me, treating me with a level of reverence the Vance family could only dream of receiving. "It appears your family is completely out of touch with reality, Vivian. Ms. Vance did not just pay for this suite out of pocket. At 6 o'clock this morning, her private holding company finalized a multi-million-dollar endowment to our maternity ward. By unanimous vote of the board of directors, this entire floor has just been officially renamed the Nia Angel Wing. She is not just a patient, she is the largest anonymous shareholder of Atlanta Medical." The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. It was not just quiet. It was the sound of an entire generational hierarchy instantly collapsing in on itself. Vivian's jaw went completely slack. The color drained from her perfectly made-up face. The vintage champagne flute slipped directly through her manicured fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, explosive crash, sending shards of crystal and expensive liquor splashing across her designer shoes. She did not even jump. She just stared at me, her mind short-circuiting as she tried to process the impossible information. Brad was the first to try and claw his way out of the shock. He shook his head violently, his face turning pale as his legal mind desperately searched for a rational explanation. "That is impossible," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I know her finances. I manage her finances. She does not have millions of dollars to endow a hospital wing. I froze her assets last night. This is a scam." "She is lying to you, Harrison. She is playing some kind of psychotic game." I shifted my sleeping daughter gently in my arms and took a slow, deliberate step toward Brad. "You froze the joint accounts, Brad. You froze the accounts I let you see, the accounts I purposefully kept small enough to make you feel like the brilliant financial mastermind you so desperately needed to be. Did you honestly think I spent the last 5 years sitting at home waiting for my allowance?" I looked around the room, making direct eye contact with each of my stunned abusers. When Marcus told me my little e-commerce business was a cute hobby and refused to invest a dime into my ideas, I built it anyway. While all of you were attending country club luncheons and gossiping about my public school education, I was securing international manufacturing contracts. My luxury maternity brand went global 2 years ago. I did not need your family money, Vivian. I make more in a single fiscal quarter than your outdated investment fund generates in an entire year. Marcus looked like he had been struck by lightning. He stared at me, his eyes wide, as the pieces finally began to fall into place. The late nights I spent working in my home office, the sudden upgrades to our lifestyle that I always casually attributed to his quarterly bonuses, the fact that I never once asked him for money or complained about our budget. He had been sleeping next to a self-made millionaire for years and was too blinded by his own arrogance and prejudice to even notice. "But you are wearing a cheap hospital gown," Chloe blurted out, her voice trembling as she clutched the premium sheets. She was staring at me like I was a ghost. "You moved into the regular room. You let us take the VIP suite. Why would you do that if you are so rich? Why didn't you just tell them who you were?" I turned my gaze to the girl sitting in the bed that should have been mine. Because money doesn't buy class. Chloe, a lesson this family desperately needs to learn. I gave up the room because I refused to bring my beautiful daughter into a space tainted by a cheating coward and his desperate mistress. I wanted to see exactly how far Marcus was willing to go. I wanted him to show me his true colors so I could burn his entire world to the ground with a completely clear conscience. Vivian was practically hyperventilating now. She looked down at the broken glass at her feet, then up at me, her mind frantically trying to recalculate my worth in her shallow, status-driven world. The woman she had spent half a decade treating like absolute trash was suddenly the most powerful person in the room. "You lied to us!" Vivian gasped, clutching her pearl necklace as if she were having a heart attack. "You deceived this family. You came into my home and pretended to be nothing." "I did not pretend to be nothing, Vivian. I simply allowed you to see what you wanted to see. You needed a peasant to look down on. You needed a scapegoat to make your own shallow lives feel important. I gave you the exact version of Nia you demanded, and you took the bait every single time. You were so busy judging the neighborhood I grew up in that you never bothered to check the balance sheets of the industry I was conquering." Brad ran a trembling hand through his hair, his legal instincts finally kicking back in as a desperate survival mechanism. "Okay, fine. So you have a successful company. Congratulations. That does not change the fact that Marcus is still your legal husband. If you are as wealthy as you say you are, half of that business belongs to him. Georgia is an equitable distribution state. I will file an injunction on your corporate assets before lunch. You are going to have to cut him a massive check." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was the first time I had smiled all morning. "Oh, Brad, you really are slipping. Did you forget the post-nuptial agreement you practically forced me to sign 3 years ago? The one you aggressively drafted to ensure I could never touch the Vance family trust if we ever got divorced." Brad froze, his eyes widening in pure horror. "You were so eager to protect Marcus that you included an ironclad clause stating all future businesses created by either party would remain sole and separate property." I reminded him, my voice dripping with sweet satisfaction. "You legally walled Marcus off from my entire empire with your own 2 hands. You dug the moat to keep me out, and you accidentally locked yourselves on the sinking ship." Brad's face drained of all remaining color. He literally stumbled backward, his back hitting the mahogany wet bar. He had outsmarted himself. The brilliant legal trap he had built to destroy the poor girl from the South Side was now the impenetrable shield protecting my entire fortune. Marcus was breathing heavily, looking back and forth between me and Brad, realizing that his grand exit strategy was turning into an absolute financial nightmare. But his ego was too massive to accept total defeat. He still thought he had one trump card left. He still thought he had his new loyal family. He reached over and grabbed Chloe's hand, pulling her closer to his side. "It doesn't matter," Marcus spat, his voice shaking with desperate, pathetic defiance. "Keep your money, Nia. I don't care. I have Chloe. I have a woman who actually respects me, and she is giving me the son I have always wanted. She is giving me the true heir to the Vance legacy that is worth more than anything you could ever buy." I looked at the two of them, their hands tightly intertwined in a tragic display of solidarity. The hospital director stepped back quietly, knowing exactly what was about to happen. I reached into the deep pocket of my emerald silk robe. "Is that so, Marcus?" I asked softly. "Let's talk about that precious son of yours." I pulled my free hand out of the deep pocket of my emerald silk robe. My fingers were tightly gripping a thick manila folder bearing the official seal of Atlanta Medical. I tossed it onto the polished mahogany coffee table in the center of the VIP suite. The heavy slap of the paper hitting the wood echoed sharply in the quiet room. "Go ahead and open it, Marcus," I said. "I had," my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Consider it a push present from me to you." Marcus stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. He looked at me, then down at the table, his chest heaving with anxious, shallow breaths. Chloe, however, recognized the folder immediately. The smug, entitled expression she had been wearing all morning instantly vanished. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. She lunged forward, desperately clawing at the table to grab the file before Marcus could reach it. "Don't look at it, baby!" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking in genuine panic. "She is trying to trick us. She forged those papers to ruin our family. Don't touch it." Marcus easily caught her wrist, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He pushed her back onto the plush mattress and picked up the folder. His hands were actually trembling as he flipped it open. Vivian and Brad leaned in closer, their eyes glued to the documents, desperately searching for a loophole that would somehow save their precious reality. "Read it out loud, Marcus," I instructed calmly. "Read the diagnosis from Dr. Evans on page 2, the one dated yesterday afternoon." Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the crisp white paper, his pupils darting back and forth as he tried to comprehend the medical terminology. "Patient exhibits significant abdominal distension," he read, his voice wavering. "Ultrasound confirms the presence of an 18-centimeter complex cystic mass on the right ovary. Surgical intervention is required immediately." He stopped reading. The air in the room grew incredibly thin. Brad snatched the paper directly out of Marcus's hands. His eyes frantically scanned the rest of the page. "Where is the obstetrics report?" Brad demanded, flipping through the remaining pages. "Where is the fetal heartbeat log? Where is the sonogram of the boy?" "There is no boy, Brad," and I said, taking a slow step forward so they could all hear every single syllable clearly. "There is no baby. There never was a baby. Your golden grandson is nothing more than a massive fluid-filled tumor." The silence that descended upon the room was absolute and suffocating. It was the sound of a generational delusion violently shattering into a million jagged pieces. Chloe had her hands clamped over her face, sobbing uncontrollably. But these were not the fake theatrical tears she had been crying earlier to manipulate Marcus. These were the panicked, hyperventilating sobs of a cornered criminal who realized the game was entirely over. I looked directly at Vivian, who was swaying slightly on her feet, as if she had just been physically struck. "Chloe played you all perfectly," I explained, keeping my tone as casual as if I were discussing the weather. "She bought fake sonograms online. She used her medical condition to fake a baby bump. Whenever Marcus wanted to come to a prenatal appointment, she threw a hysterical fit, claiming her stress levels were too high and she needed to see the doctor alone. And you all bought it. You were so blinded by your desperate, archaic need for a male heir that you never once demanded proof." Marcus was staring at Chloe, his eyes wide and completely unblinking. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a severe coma. "You lied to me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over Chloe's frantic crying. "You told me you were carrying my son." I let out a soft, mocking sigh. "Of course she lied to you, Marcus. She knew Vivian was desperate for a grandson. She knew you were desperate to prove your virility and secure your place at the head of the fund. Her plan was brilliant in its simplicity. She was going to milk you for a massive trust fund, secure a luxury condo, undergo her laparoscopic cyst removal surgery today under the guise of a complicated delivery, and then tragically tell you the baby did not survive. She would have walked away a millionaire playing the grieving mother while you footed the bill for the rest of her life. And it would have worked beautifully if she had not tried to execute her little scam in the exact hospital where I sit on the board of directors." The realization hit Marcus like a freight train. His entire reality collapsed in real time. He had thrown away his marriage to a self-made millionaire. He had participated in federal wire fraud. He had alienated the mother of his actual child, and he had done it all for a 23-year-old assistant with an ovarian cyst. A guttural, animalistic roar tore from Marcus's throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated humiliation. He spun around and struck Chloe across the face with the back of his hand. The slap echoed through the VIP suite like a gunshot. Chloe screamed, tumbling backward against the pillows, her hand flying up to cover the angry red welt, instantly blossoming across her cheek. "You crazy lying gold digger!" Marcus screamed, completely losing his polished, gentlemanly facade. He lunged toward the bed, his hands curled into tight fists. He looked like he wanted to wrap his fingers around her throat. "I gave up everything for you. I bought you a house. I moved you into my family." Hospital Director Harrison immediately stepped forward, grabbing Marcus by the shoulder and shoving him back forcefully. "Keep your hands to yourself, Marcus," the director warned, his voice booming with authority. "If you strike her again in my hospital, I will have the police drag you out of here in chains right now." But the violence was contagious. Vivian suddenly snapped out of her catatonic state. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as she looked at Chloe. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek and threw herself toward the bed. "My vintage Cartier bracelet?" Vivian screamed, her perfectly manicured hands clawing at the air. "I gave you my grandmother's diamond bracelet as a family heirloom for the baby. You absolute trash. You filthy lying peasant. You conned my family. You made me brag about you to the entire country club. I will destroy you. I will have you thrown in jail for the rest of your miserable life." Jada had to rush forward, grabbing her mother around the waist and pulling her back before Vivian could physically assault Chloe. Vivian was thrashing wildly, completely stripped of the elegant respectability politics she worshipped so deeply. She was acting exactly like the chaotic, unhinged women she always claimed to despise. Her precious social standing was completely ruined. Everyone in their elite social circle would soon know that the mighty Vance family had been swindled by a young administrative assistant with a fake pregnancy. And then there was Brad. Brad was not screaming. He was not throwing punches. He had backed away from the chaos, sliding slowly down the mahogany wet bar until he was sitting flat on the floor. His hands were gripping his hair, his eyes staring blankly at the shards of broken champagne glass scattered across the marble tiles. The magnitude of the situation had finally crushed his arrogant legal mind. He realized that the millions of dollars he had illegally transferred last night were completely gone. The male heir that was supposed to secure the family legacy was a biological illusion. The quiet, compliant wife they had spent 5 years underestimating was a corporate titan who had meticulously engineered their total destruction. There was no way out, no legal loophole, no offshore account that could save him. The Vance family empire was officially reduced to ashes. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, cradling my beautiful daughter against my chest. She was sleeping soundly, completely undisturbed by the screaming, crying, and violence erupting all around us. I watched the people who had tormented me for 5 years violently tear each other to shreds. They were ripping each other apart with the exact same teeth they had once used to bite me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel any lingering sorrow for the end of my marriage. I just felt a profound, radiant warmth spreading through my chest. I had not just leveled the playing field. I had detonated the entire stadium. Chloe was sobbing hysterically, begging Marcus for forgiveness, claiming she only did it because she loved him so much. Marcus was pacing the room like a caged animal, shouting profanities and kicking the expensive furniture. Vivian was weeping into Jada's shoulder, mourning the loss of her social status more than she mourned the loss of her son's marriage. I took a deep breath. The scent of the expensive blue hydrangeas suddenly smelled remarkably sweet. The vultures were officially feeding on their own kind, but the show was not quite over yet. I turned my head slightly, listening closely to the quiet hum of the hospital corridor. I was waiting for a very specific sound, and right on cue, the heavy synchronized footsteps of federal agents began echoing down the hallway, marching directly toward the VIP suite. But before the heavy oak doors could swing open to reveal the authorities, Brad pushed himself up from the floor. He refused to accept that he had been outplayed. His arrogant legal mind simply could not process the concept of total defeat. He brushed the invisible dust off his expensive gray suit trousers, deliberately stepping over the shards of broken champagne glass. He adjusted his silk tie, took a deep breath, and desperately attempted to rebuild the impenetrable fortress of his white male privilege. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Hospital Director Harrison. "You are completely finished, Harrison." Brad snarled, his voice rising in pitch as he tried to project an authority he no longer possessed. "You just stood there and allowed a patient's highly confidential medical records to be weaponized and broadcasted in front of multiple unauthorized individuals. That is a textbook violation of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. I'm going to file a massive federal lawsuit against this hospital before the sun goes down. I will personally see to it that your medical license is permanently revoked, and I will bankrupt this entire facility with punitive damages." Dr. Harrison did not even blink. He looked at Brad with a calm, practiced indifference. "You are welcome to try, Brad," the director replied smoothly. "However, considering the patient in question actively used our facility to execute a premeditated scheme to extort a major donor, and considering the medical file was legally subpoenaed by the hospital's internal fraud department just 10 minutes ago, I think you will find your lawsuit completely baseless. Now I highly suggest you lower your voice." Brad scoffed loudly, turning his furious gaze away from the director and locking it entirely onto me. He marched toward the center of the room, intentionally placing himself between me and the rest of the devastated Vance family. He was trying to act like their savior again. He needed to prove that he was still the smartest person in the room. "You think you won, Naya?" He spat, his blue eyes burning with toxic defiance. "You think because you exposed this pathetic little gold digger you have somehow defeated us? You are delusional. So what if Chloe lied about the baby? So what if Marcus made a terrible personal decision that is just embarrassing family gossip? It means absolutely nothing in the real world." He turned around and gestured wildly to Marcus and Vivian, who were still paralyzed by the chaotic fallout of Chloe's fake pregnancy. "Stop crying," Brad barked at them, trying to snap them out of their misery. "We are fine. Do you hear me? We are completely fine. We still have the capital." Vivian looked up at him, her mascara running down her face in thick black streaks. "What capital?" She whimpered, her voice entirely broken. "We are a laughingstock, Brad. Our social standing in Atlanta is completely ruined." "Social standing doesn't pay the bills, Vivian," Brad shouted, completely losing his composed corporate demeanor. "Cash pays the bills, and we have plenty of it." He spun back around to face me, a grotesque, victorious smirk stretching across his face. He actually thought he was about to deliver a killing blow. "You might have your little e-commerce company, Nia," he boasted loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "But I still successfully triggered the dissolution of your assets last night. I still moved $12 million of the fund's capital into an untraceable offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. And because I used your LLC to wash the money, you are the only one on the hook for it. I don't care if you sit on the board of this hospital. I don't care if you have a few million tucked away. I have systematically drained the Vance family fund, secured the wealth under Vivian's name, and legally framed you for the entire embezzlement operation. You are going to spend the next 10 years fighting federal prosecutors while we enjoy our dividends in peace." He crossed his arms, looking me up and down with absolute contempt. "You can walk around in your fancy silk robe all you want, but at the end of the day, I am the fund's lawyer. I control the money, and whoever controls the money controls the reality. You cannot beat me." I stood perfectly still, cradling my sleeping daughter. I did not interrupt him. I let him shout. I let him boast about his offshore accounts and his brilliant money laundering scheme right in front of the hospital director. I watched him dig his grave so incredibly deep that he would never be able to climb out. The dramatic irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. He was bragging about a financial victory that had already been entirely dismantled. Before I could offer him a single word of response, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the tense air of the VIP suite. It was Brad's cell phone. The custom obnoxious ringtone echoed loudly from the inner pocket of his suit jacket. Brad paused, his arrogant smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second. He pulled the phone out, clearly annoyed by the interruption. He glanced at the caller ID, and his posture immediately stiffened. He looked at Marcus, waving his hand dismissively. "It is Charles," Brad muttered, referring to the senior managing partner of his elite corporate law firm. "He is probably calling to confirm the Cayman wire transfers cleared. Let me just put this to bed so we can get out of this miserable building." He swiped the screen and lifted the phone to his ear, putting on his best, most confident professional voice. "Charles, good morning. I am dealing with a minor family emergency at the hospital, but I assume you are calling to confirm the asset restructuring for the Vance account." I watched Brad's face intently. I watched the exact moment his entire world stopped spinning. The voice on the other end of the line was loud enough that I could hear the frantic, panicked tone, even if I could not make out the exact words. Brad stood frozen in the center of the room. He did not say anything. He just listened. Slowly, agonizingly, every single drop of blood drained from Brad's face. His healthy, tanned complexion turned the color of wet ash. His jaw went completely slack, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish suffocating on dry land. His eyes grew wide, darting frantically around the room as if he were looking for an emergency exit that did not exist. "What do you mean they bounced?" Brad finally whispered. His voice was incredibly small, completely stripped of its usual booming authority. "What do you mean the Cayman accounts are frozen, Charles? That is impossible. I initiated the transfers myself. I used the secure portal." Another burst of frantic shouting came from the phone. Brad's knees actually buckled slightly. He reached out and grabbed the edge of the mahogany coffee table to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. "No," Brad stammered, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. "No, no, no, they cannot be in the lobby. The Securities and Exchange Commission does not just raid a law firm without a subpoena. Charles, who gave them the authorization, who gave them the audio files." Brad slowly lowered the phone from his ear. The call was not disconnected, but he was no longer listening. His hand was shaking so violently that the expensive smartphone slipped right through his fingers. It hit the marble floor with a loud crack, the screen shattering into a spider web of broken glass. He slowly turned his head and looked at me. The absolute terror in his eyes was magnificent. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting for the devastating impact of the ground below. He finally realized that I had not just been sitting quietly for the last 5 years. He realized that the $12 million he thought he stole was currently sitting safely in a government holding account. He realized that the conversation we had in my hospital room just 30 minutes ago was the exact audio recording the SEC was currently using to tear his prestigious law firm apart. Brad choked out, his vocal cords barely functioning. "You recorded me." I offered him a slow, chilling smile. "I told you, Brad. I am the one who controls the reality now." And right at that exact moment, the heavy, synchronized footsteps in the hallway finally stopped right outside our door. The heavy oak doors did not just open. They were violently thrust apart with such tremendous force that the brass handles slammed against the drywall, leaving deep, permanent dents in the pristine hospital walls. A flood of dark, tactical windbreakers bearing bright yellow FBI lettering poured into the luxury maternity suite. They moved with a terrifying, practiced efficiency, their heavy tactical boots squeaking sharply against the polished marble floor. There was no polite knock. There was no gentle inquiry. There was only the overwhelming, suffocating presence of absolute authority. "FBI, nobody move. Keep your hands exactly where I can see them." The command was delivered by a tall, broad-shouldered agent who stepped directly into the center of the room. His voice did not echo. It shattered the remaining air in the suite like a hammer striking glass. Behind him, 4 more agents fanned out instantly, securing the perimeter of the room and blocking the only exit. They were closely followed by 3 men wearing sharp, understated gray suits, their lapels adorned with the subtle pins of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The contrast was incredibly jarring. This was supposed to be a sanctuary of wealth and privilege, a room filled with crystal vases, vintage champagne, and plush velvet chairs. Now it was a secured federal crime scene. Hospital Director Harrison smoothly stepped backward, pressing himself flat against the wall near the window. He offered a quick, respectful nod to the lead agent, making it entirely clear that the hospital was fully cooperating with the federal raid. He had known this was coming. He had simply been waiting for my signal to clear the hallway. The reaction from this Vance family was instantaneous and pathetic. For a group of people who constantly bragged about their power and influence, they completely crumbled the second they faced real, undeniable consequences. Chloe let out a high-pitched, terrified scream. She scrambled backward on the mattress, grabbing the thick cashmere blankets and pulling them over her head, as if she could somehow hide from the federal government in a hospital bed. Vivian gasped, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She stumbled backward until her back hit the windowsill, knocking over a massive vase of blue hydrangeas. The water spilled down the wall, soaking into the carpet, but she did not even notice. She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting frantically from the badges on the agents' jackets to the guns holstered securely at their hips. Jada froze completely, her arms wrapped tightly around her own stomach, her face drained of all color. They had spent their entire lives insulating themselves from the real world, believing their wealth made them completely immune to the law. Seeing federal agents standing in their private suite was a reality their privileged minds simply could not comprehend. "Marcus Bradley Vance and Bradley Hayes." The lead agent barked, his sharp eyes scanning the room until they locked onto his targets. "Identify yourselves immediately." Marcus was still standing near the foot of the bed. Even in the face of a federal raid, his monumental ego refused to let him submit. He honestly believed he could talk his way out of this. He thought this was just a misunderstanding that could be solved with a phone call to his country club buddies or a massive donation to a police charity fund. He puffed out his chest, stepping forward and aggressively pointing a finger at the lead agent. "What is the meaning of this?" Marcus demanded, his voice trembling, but desperately trying to sound authoritative. "Do you have any idea who you are pointing your fingers at? I am Marcus Vance. This is a private medical suite. My partner just went through a traumatic medical procedure. You have absolutely no jurisdiction to barge in here like common thugs. I demand you leave this room immediately, before I call the mayor." The lead agent did not even blink. He did not care about the mayor. He did not care about the Vance family legacy. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a tightly folded piece of paper, and flicked his wrist, allowing the official federal warrant to unfold. "I have a federal arrest warrant signed by a United States District Judge," the agent stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You are being detained on suspicion of federal wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit financial embezzlement. Put your hands behind your back." Marcus froze. The words wire fraud and embezzlement hit him physically, knocking the remaining breath out of his lungs. He finally looked past the lead agent and saw the men in the gray suits, the SEC investigators. The reality of the situation crashed down on him. He slowly turned his head to look at Brad, expecting his brilliant Ivy League-educated lawyer to step in and save them. He expected Brad to start shouting legal jargon, demanding to see the warrant threatening the agents with massive lawsuits. "Brad," Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming panic. "Brad, tell them they cannot do this. Call the firm. Do something." But Brad did not do anything. Brad was still standing near the mahogany wet bar, his shattered cell phone lying in pieces by his feet. He did not puff out his chest. He did not argue about jurisdiction. He knew exactly what the presence of the SEC meant. He knew that the audio recording I had captured just moments ago was already sitting on a federal server, providing irrefutable proof of his crimes. He knew that the $12 million he had tried to wash through the Cayman Islands had been intercepted. He was a corporate lawyer, and he knew that when the federal government shows up with a signed warrant and SEC investigators in tow, the game is completely over. Brad slowly raised his hands in the air. His shoulders slumped forward in total, humiliating defeat. "It is over, Marcus," Brad whispered, his voice incredibly hollow. "Just shut up and put your hands up. Don't make it worse." Marcus stared at his brother-in-law in absolute horror. The impenetrable shield of their legal strategy had just vanished into thin air. Vivian, unable to accept that her golden son was about to be handcuffed, suddenly pushed herself away from the windowsill. She marched forward, her heels clicking aggressively, waving her hands in the air. "Officers, there has been a terrible mistake," Vivian shouted, trying to utilize the shrill, demanding tone she usually reserved for waitstaff and retail workers. "We are the Vance family. My late husband was a state senator. We are highly respected members of the community. You cannot just march in here and accuse my son of these disgusting crimes. Someone has clearly fabricated this entire story to ruin our reputation." A female FBI agent immediately stepped directly into Vivian's path, holding up a firm, unyielding hand. "Ma'am, you need to step back against the wall right now," the agent commanded sharply. "If you attempt to interfere with a federal arrest, you will be placed in handcuffs and charged with obstruction of justice. Do not take another step." Vivian stopped dead in her tracks. Nobody had ever spoken to her like that in her entire life. She looked at the female agent, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find the words to assert her dominance, but she had none left. She slowly backed away, her hands shaking violently, pressing herself against the wall next to a terrified Jada. At that moment, the lead SEC investigator stepped out from behind the FBI agents. He was a tall man with a sharp, intelligent face. He held a secure digital tablet in one hand. I recognized him immediately. It was Agent Davis, the man I had been feeding financial data to for the last 8 months. Agent Davis surveyed the chaotic room, taking in the broken glass, the spilled flowers, and the terrified faces of the Vance family. Then his eyes found me. I was still standing calmly near the doorway, holding my sleeping daughter entirely untouched by the federal agents who had swarmed the room. Agent Davis offered me a small, respectful nod. It was a silent acknowledgement of a job perfectly executed. Marcus caught the exchange. He looked at Agent Davis and then he looked at me. His eyes widened as the final devastating piece of the puzzle locked into place. He finally realized that I had not just called the police out of spite. I had not just reported a minor financial discrepancy. I had meticulously orchestrated a massive federal sting operation right under his nose, and I had timed the absolute destruction of his life perfectly to coincide with the birth of his fake heir. Marcus stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as his brain completely misfired. The polished, arrogant executive who had confidently ordered me out of this very room just hours ago was entirely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified boy who had finally realized he was swimming in an ocean entirely controlled by the woman he thought was a puddle. I took a slow, deliberate step away from the doorway and leaned casually against the pristine wallpaper. I shifted my daughter higher on my shoulder, completely unbothered by the heavily armed federal agents securing the perimeter of the room. 8 months, Marcus, I said. I let the silence hang for a fraction of a second to ensure the weight of those words crushed him properly. 8 months ago, I noticed a severe discrepancy in the quarterly tax filings Brad submitted for my limited liability company. Brad let out a sharp, involuntary gasp from his spot on the floor near the wet bar. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. You see, Brad assumed I never actually read the documents he put in front of me, I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. He thought my public school education made me mathematically illiterate. He relied heavily on the stereotype that a woman from my background would be too intimidated by corporate legal jargon to ask any questions. But when you secretly build and run an international e-commerce empire, you learn exactly how to read a balance sheet. I saw the phantom vendor payments, I saw the offshore shell companies, I saw every single dirty trick you two arrogant fools thought you were hiding so brilliantly. Marcus shook his head violently, his perfectly styled hair falling into his eyes. He took a staggering step forward, raising a trembling hand. You, he stammered, his voice cracking. You went to the government over a tax mistake. You called the feds on your own family. Oh, it was much more than a simple tax mistake, Marcus, I replied, offering him a cold, unforgiving smile. It was a $12 million embezzlement ring. And yes, I went to the government. The very next morning, I walked straight into the regional headquarters of the Securities and Exchange Commission and sat down with Agent Davis. I handed over a decrypted hard drive containing 3 years of your fraudulent financial records. I became an official federally protected whistleblower. Agent Davis stepped forward, confirming my statement with a sharp nod. Ms. Vance has been an invaluable asset to our ongoing investigation, the SEC investigator stated, his voice completely devoid of sympathy for the men he was about to arrest. Her financial literacy and meticulous record-keeping provided us with the exact paper trail we needed to completely map your criminal network. She handed us your entire operation on a silver platter. The reality of my words slammed into Marcus with the force of a physical blow. He staggered backward, hitting the edge of the hospital bed where Chloe was still hiding under the expensive cashmere blankets. He looked at me as if he were staring at an alien species. He had spent 5 years treating me like a charity case. He had genuinely believed I was entirely dependent on his wealth, his status, and his last name. He had used my supposed lack of sophistication to justify his cheating, his cruelty, and his ultimate betrayal. And now he was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment engineered entirely by the woman he thought was completely clueless. While he had been busy buying diamond bracelets for his young assistant and plotting his grand exit strategy, I had been sitting in undisclosed meeting rooms with federal prosecutors, systematically dismantling his entire life, piece by piece. But I still needed the final nail in the coffin, I said, turning my attention away from my shattered husband and focusing entirely on Brad. I needed hard, undeniable evidence that tied the two of you directly to the intent to defraud. I needed proof that you were maliciously using my business name without my explicit knowledge to wash your stolen money. I needed a confession. Brad squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a pathetic whimper. He knew exactly what was coming. I reminded him of our little chat down the hall in room 314. I said, my voice dropping to a low, mocking whisper. I told you I was terrified, Brad. I begged you to explain to me how you drained our accounts, and you just couldn't resist the bait. Could you? Your massive, fragile ego demanded that you explain every single detail of your brilliant criminal enterprise to the poor, uneducated black woman. You needed to feel superior. You needed to prove you were the smartest man in the room. I pulled my smartphone out of my pocket and held it up for the entire room to see. You practically gave the federal prosecutors a masterclass in corporate fraud, I told him, tapping the glass screen of my phone. You explicitly named the shell companies. You confirmed the exact dollar amount of $12 million, and you happily admitted to using my company as a front. You handed me your own severed head on a silver platter, and my smartwatch recorded every single syllable of it. The lead FBI agent reached to his belt, unclipping a heavy pair of steel handcuffs. The audio file was successfully transmitted to our secure servers and reviewed by a federal judge 20 minutes ago. The agent confirmed his deep voice, leaving absolutely no room for debate. It provided the direct probable cause required to execute this immediate arrest warrant. Vivian let out a strangled, terrifying sob. She finally understood that her son was not going to talk his way out of this. The impenetrable Vance family armor had been completely shredded. She pushed herself away from the wall, pointing a frantic, trembling finger at her son-in-law. "It was him!" Vivian screamed, her voice completely hysterical as she desperately tried to throw Brad under the bus to save her own blood. "It was Brad. He is the lawyer. He manipulated the accounts. Marcus did not know what was going on. Marcus is innocent. He trusted his lawyer. You cannot arrest my son for something his brother-in-law did." Agent Davis did not even look at Vivian. He kept his eyes locked on Marcus. "The managing director's signature is on every single unauthorized wire transfer, Vivian," the investigator stated coldly. "Marcus authorized the movement of client funds into the dummy accounts. He is a fully complicit co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar federal fraud case. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense, and in this case, neither is arrogance." Marcus physically collapsed. Marcus. His knees simply gave out beneath him, and he dropped heavily onto the polished marble floor of the VIP suite. He landed right next to the puddle of spilled champagne and broken crystal. He stared blankly at the wall, his breathing fast and shallow. He had lost everything in the span of 30 minutes: his wife, his child, his wealth, his reputation, and now his freedom. He had brought his mistress into my hospital room to humiliate me. He had tried to strip me of my dignity and cast me out into the cold. He thought he was the ultimate predator, discarding the weak link in his family chain. He never stopped to consider that the quiet, resilient woman he was discarding had spent her entire life learning how to survive the darkest storms. He never realized that by throwing me out into the cold, he had simply introduced me to my natural habitat, and I had thrived. I stood tall against the wall, holding the true heir to my own empire securely in my arms. I watched Marcus kneel on the floor, waiting for the federal agents to finally step forward and close the trap I had so meticulously set. The heavy silence in the VIP suite was finally broken by the sharp rustle of tactical nylon. The lead FBI agent stepped directly in front of Marcus, who was still kneeling on the marble floor amidst the shattered crystal. The agent looked down at him with the cold, mechanical detachment of a man who dealt with ruined lives every single day. "Marcus Bradley Vance," the agent announced, his deep voice carrying the full, uncompromising weight of the United States government. "You are officially under arrest. The charges are conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, grand embezzlement, and the unauthorized transfer of corporate assets. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The Miranda warnings. The Miranda. A speech Marcus had likely only ever heard on television was now being read directly to his face in the middle of a luxury maternity suite. He did not move. He did not speak. He just stared blankly at the wet carpet, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow jerks. The golden boy of Atlanta's elite society, the man who had confidently ordered me out of my own hospital room just hours ago, was completely broken. But Brad was not ready to surrender. The sound of the Miranda warning seemed to act like a defibrillator on Brad's paralyzed legal mind. He suddenly snapped out of his shock, his survival instincts violently overriding his panic. He stood up straight, his face turning a deep, angry shade of red. He was a wealthy, white corporate attorney who had spent his entire life bullying people in boardrooms and courtrooms. He firmly believed that if he just shouted loud enough, if he just threw around enough legal jargon, the rules would magically bend to his will. "Do not say a single word, Marcus," Brad bellowed, stepping forward and aggressively pointing his finger at the lead FBI agent. "I am his legal counsel, and I am formally invoking his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. You are not to ask him another question without my explicit presence. Furthermore, I demand to see the physical affidavit supporting this ridiculous warrant. This is a civil dispute over marital assets. It is a family court issue, not a federal crime. You are completely out of your jurisdiction." Agent Davis calmly stepped in front of the FBI agent, blocking Brad's path. He looked at the screaming lawyer with a mix of amusement and profound disgust. "You cannot represent him, Mr. Hayes," Agent Davis stated smoothly, adjusting his tablet. "You cannot represent him because you are a named co-conspirator on the exact same federal indictment." Brad scoffed loudly, attempting to project a shield of absolute confidence. "I am the managing partner of a Tier 1 corporate law firm, Davis. You have absolutely nothing on me. You think an illegally obtained audio recording from a bitter ex-wife is going to hold up in federal court? I will have that evidence thrown out in 5 minutes during the preliminary hearing. You are making a massive career mistake. I know federal judges. I play golf with the district attorney. I will destroy you for this." Agent Davis did not even flinch at the threat. He simply scrolled down on his tablet and began reading aloud, his voice cutting through Brad's hysterical boasting. "Bradley Thomas Hayes, you are under arrest for 2 counts of felony wire fraud, 3 counts of identity theft, and 1 count of forging signatures to open unauthorized corporate accounts. The audio recording was not illegally obtained. Ms. Vance was acting as an active documented whistleblower under the direct protection of the Securities and Exchange Commission. We have the metadata from your computer. We have the forged signature cards from the bank. We have the offshore routing numbers you utilized last night." Agent Davis paused, looking Brad directly in the eye. "You do not have a civil dispute, Brad. You have a multi-million-dollar federal crime. Your firm is currently being raided by our agents as we speak. Your legal career is officially over. Put your hands behind your back." The color vanished from Brad's face for the second time that morning. The mention of his firm being raided was the final fatal blow. The arrogant armor he had worn his entire life instantly shattered into dust. He opened his mouth to argue, to scream about his rights again, but no words came out. He was finally completely out of legal loopholes. 2 heavily armed FBI agents immediately moved in on Brad. They did not treat him with the delicate respect he believed his expensive suit warranted. One agent grabbed Brad's left arm, twisting it forcefully behind his back. "Hey, get your hands off me!" Brad shouted, a brief flash of panic breaking through his stunned silence. "I am cooperating. You do not need to manhandle me." "Do not ruin my jacket." The agents ignored his pathetic demands. The second agent grabbed his right arm, pulling it back to meet the left. And then the sound happened. Click, click. The loud metallic ratcheting of the steel handcuffs snapping tightly onto Brad's wrists echoed sharply through the luxurious VIP room. It was a harsh, unforgiving sound. It was the sound of absolute finality. The cold steel bit into the crisp white cuffs of his custom-tailored shirt, locking him into a reality he could no longer manipulate or control. At the exact same moment, 2 other agents hauled Marcus up from the floor. He was dead weight, his legs barely supporting him. They spun him around, pressing his chest against the polished mahogany of the wet bar. Click, click. The second pair of steel bracelets snapped shut around Marcus's wrists. I stood perfectly still, watching the scene unfold. The juxtaposition was absolutely staggering. Here were 2 men dressed in thousands of dollars worth of custom tailoring, standing in a room filled with expensive blue hydrangeas and vintage champagne, physically restrained by the cold, heavy steel of federal handcuffs. The illusion of their superiority had been entirely stripped away, exposing them as nothing more than common criminals caught in their own trap. Vivian let out a long, high-pitched wail, burying her face into Jada's shoulder. She could not bear to look at her golden son and her brilliant son-in-law being treated like dangerous felons. Her precious high society world had violently imploded, and she knew there was absolutely no way to hide this from her country club friends. The Vance family name was permanently destroyed. Marcus slowly turned his head to look over his shoulder. His eyes, red and brimming with unshed tears, sought me out across the room. He looked at me standing tall and unharmed, holding the daughter he had been so willing to discard just hours ago. He finally understood the absolute magnitude of what he had thrown away. He had traded a loyal, brilliant partner for a lying extortionist, and he had traded his freedom for a few $1,000,000 he would never get to spend. I did not offer him a smile. I did not offer him a frown. I simply looked back at him with the exact same cold, empty detachment he had shown me when he ordered me out of this room. The power dynamic had permanently shifted, and the steel bracelets locking his hands behind his back were the ultimate, undeniable proof of my victory. The agents did not give Marcus and Brad any time to process their new reality. They hauled the two men to their feet, their expensive Italian leather shoes slipping slightly on the spilled champagne. Marcus kept his head down, his shoulders hunched, trying to hide his face. He knew that the moment he stepped out of this private suite, he would be paraded through the public corridors of Atlanta Medical. The nurses he had just ordered around the doctors he had threatened, the security guards he had belittled, they would all see the mighty Marcus Vance doing a federal perp walk in handcuffs. Vivian watched them drag her son toward the heavy oak doors. Her breathing became dangerously erratic. She pressed both hands to her chest, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fabric of her Chanel suit. She was not just watching her family being arrested. She was watching the total evaporation of her entire identity. For 60 years, Vivian had built her worth on the foundation of the Vance family money. She had used that wealth to bully, isolate, and intimidate anyone she deemed beneath her. She had used it to terrorize me. But with Brad's offshore accounts frozen and the family funds seized by the Securities and Exchange Commission, Vivian suddenly realized she was entirely destitute. The mansion in Buckhead would be foreclosed. The country club memberships would be immediately revoked. The society friends she had spent decades cultivating would instantly block her phone number the moment the federal indictments hit the evening news. The respectability she worshipped was gone. She was no longer the matriarch of an elite Atlanta dynasty. She was just the broke, humiliated mother of two convicted felons. The sheer weight of that realization was too much for her fragile, status-obsessed mind to handle. Vivian let out a short, high-pitched gasp. Her eyes rolled back into her head and her knees completely buckled. She collapsed straight backward, hitting the hospital floor with a heavy, ungraceful thud. Jada screamed, dropping to her knees beside her mother. She frantically patted Vivian's face, begging her to wake up. But Vivian was out cold, her pearl necklace tangled around her neck, her designer suit wrinkled and soaked with the water from the crushed hydrangeas. Jada looked up at Hospital Director Harrison, her eyes wide with terror, pleading for medical assistance. Dr. Harrison did not rush to her side. He did not shout for a crash cart. He simply stepped out into the hallway and calmly signaled for an orderly. He treated the fallen matriarch of the Vance family with the exact same clinical indifference they had always shown to the rest of the world. They were no longer VIPs. They were a massive liability. While Jada sobbed over her unconscious mother, the female FBI agent turned her attention to the hospital bed. Chloe was still huddled under the cashmere blankets, shaking like a wet dog. The agent stepped forward and ripped the blankets away, exposing Chloe in her sheer, inappropriate designer nightgown. Chloe instantly threw her hands up in the air, tears streaming down her face. "I did not do anything!" Chloe wailed, her voice cracking in a desperate attempt to sound like a helpless child. "I did not know about any money laundering. I am just the assistant. Marcus manipulated me. He forced me to lie. I am a victim here." The agent crossed her arms, completely unmoved by the theatrical display. "You are not a victim, Chloe," the agent stated firmly. "You are a suspect in an active extortion ring. We have documented proof that you utilized fraudulent medical documents to extort money and real estate from the Vance family trust. You conspired to defraud a marital estate using a fabricated pregnancy." Chloe shook her head wildly, pointing a trembling finger at me. "But she is the one with all the money," Chloe cried desperately, trying to shift the blame. "She is a millionaire. She set us up. You should be arresting her." The agent reached to her belt and pulled out a pair of heavy plastic zip ties. "Stand up and turn around," the agent commanded. "You can explain your medical miracles to the federal judge at your bail hearing." Chloe refused to stand. She clamped her hands onto the bed rails, kicking her legs and screaming that she needed her lawyer. Two agents immediately stepped in, grabbing her by the arms and forcefully dragging her off the premium mattress. She fought them the entire way, her bare feet slipping on the marble floor. They slammed her against the wall, secured her wrists with the zip ties, and began reading her the Miranda rights. The glorious, untouchable image of the Vance family was officially reduced to absolute trash in a matter of minutes. I stood quietly in my emerald silk robe, gently rocking my sleeping daughter, surveying the absolute destruction of my enemies. It looked like a bomb had gone off inside a luxury hotel room. The vintage champagne was pooling on the floor, mixing with dirt from the overturned potted plants. The thick blue folder containing my divorce papers was sitting in the trash can exactly where I had dropped it. The people who had tried to destroy my life were now physically restrained, weeping or unconscious on the floor. They had demanded I leave this room because I was not worthy of their luxury. Now they were the ones being forcibly removed, and they were leaving in chains. The lead agent signaled to his team. "Move them out," he ordered. The agents marched Marcus, Brad, and Chloe toward the exit. As Marcus was pushed through the doorway, he stopped and looked back at me one final time. There was no anger left in his eyes. There was no arrogance. There was only the hollow, devastating realization that he had engineered his own demise. He opened his mouth perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg for mercy he did not deserve. But the agent shoved him firmly in the back, forcing him out into the brightly lit hallway before he could utter a single syllable. I watched them disappear down the corridor, surrounded by federal windbreakers. Jada was left sitting alone on the floor of the ruined suite, weeping over her unconscious mother, completely stripped of her husband, her brother, and her family fortune. She did not even look at me. She was too consumed by the ashes of her own life. Dr. Harrison stepped into the room, looking around at the mess with a faint sigh. He turned to me, his posture respectful and calm. "I will have housekeeping clear this room immediately. Ms. Vance," he said softly, "would you like to return to your original suite now?" I looked down at the tiny, perfect face of my daughter. She had slept through the entire hurricane. She was completely safe, completely secure, and entirely free from the toxic lineage that had tried to claim her. "No, thank you, Dr. Harrison," I replied, my voice steady and light. "I think it is time for me to take my daughter home. We are officially done here." I pulled the cashmere blanket a little tighter around my baby, turned my back on the ruined VIP suite, and walked out into the hallway. The air felt incredibly clean. The heavy, suffocating weight of the Vance family was gone forever. I had walked into this hospital as a discarded wife, but I was leaving as an absolute queen. The dynasty was dead and my reign was just beginning. As I stepped through the heavy oak doors of the VIP suite and into the brightly lit corridor, the scene ahead of me was a portrait of poetic justice. The federal agents had paused at the end of the hall, waiting for the secure service elevator to arrive so they could discreetly remove their high-profile prisoners. Marcus was not going quietly anymore. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by the desperate clawing panic of a man who realized his life was actually over. He planted his expensive Italian loafers onto the linoleum floor, refusing to walk further. He twisted his body around, fighting against the firm grip of the FBI agents, his eyes frantically searching for me. When he saw me walking toward him, cradling our newborn daughter in my arms, his polished facade shattered completely. "Nia, please!" Marcus begged, his voice echoing shrilly down the maternity ward. The tears he had been holding back finally spilled over, streaming down his face and ruining his pristine image. "Please, do not do this. Do not let them take me away. I am so sorry. I was stupid. I was out of my mind with the pressure of the fund. We can fix this. We are a family. Think about our marriage. Think about our daughter. She needs her father." I stopped a few feet away from him. I looked at the man I had promised to spend the rest of my life with. He was crying the exact tears he had expected me to shed just a few hours ago. He was using our daughter as a bargaining chip, weaponizing her existence to save his own skin after he had just tried to replace her with a fabricated male heir. You stopped being her father the moment you handed that luxury room to your mistress, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the cutting force of a diamond blade. You do not get to claim a family you actively tried to throw in the garbage. Enjoy federal prison. Marcus. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. The agents shoved him forward. Marcus began to actively sob, screaming my name as they forced him into the metal box. The doors closed, sealing away his pathetic cries and officially severing his ties to my life. I turned my attention back toward the entrance of the VIP suite. Jada had managed to drag Vivian partially out into the hallway, propping her up against the wall. Vivian was just beginning to regain consciousness. She let out a low, disoriented groan, her eyes fluttering open as she rubbed her temple. Her designer suit was ruined, her hair was a tangled mess. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus her vision, and found me standing directly over her. I adjusted the cashmere blanket around my sleeping baby, looking down at the woman who had made it her personal mission to make me feel small. I did not step back to give her space. I stepped forward, forcing her to look up at me from the cold hospital floor. "You always said I was not in your family's class, Vivian," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the sudden quiet of the hallway. I looked her dead in the eye, ensuring she heard every single syllable of her defeat. "You were right. My class is the one sending your entire family to federal prison." I did not wait for her to formulate a response. I stepped directly over her outstretched legs, my head held high, and walked gracefully down the corridor toward the exit. The fallout was swift, absolute, and entirely public. Federal indictments do not care about generational wealth or social standing, and they certainly do not care about country club memberships. Within 48 hours of that morning in the hospital, the SEC formally seized the Vance Family Investment Fund. The subsequent audit revealed that Brad and Marcus had not just been washing money through my company, they had been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme for years, defrauding their elite clients to fund their lavish lifestyles. The $12 million I helped the government intercept was just the tip of a massive, rotting iceberg. The trial was a media spectacle. The pristine image of the Vance family was dragged through the mud on every local news station in Atlanta. Brad, the arrogant corporate lawyer who thought he was untouchable, cracked under the pressure of federal prosecution. He accepted a plea deal, turning state's evidence against Marcus in a desperate attempt to save himself. But federal judges rarely show mercy to lawyers who abuse their power. Both Brad and Marcus were sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Chloe, the 23-year-old assistant who thought a fake pregnancy was her ticket to millions, was convicted of wire fraud and extortion. She received a 5-year sentence. Her dreams of luxury condos and designer baby clothes were replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. Vivian lost everything. The bank foreclosed on her sprawling Buckhead mansion. Her accounts were frozen, and the government seized her assets to pay restitution to the defrauded clients. The woman who had spent her entire life judging others based on their zip code was forced to move into a tiny rented apartment in the suburbs, entirely cut off from the high society world she had worshipped. As for me, the divorce was finalized quickly. Because of the ironclad postnuptial agreement Brad had so arrogantly forced upon me, Marcus could not touch a single dime of my e-commerce empire. I walked away with full custody of my daughter and complete ownership of my business. But the sweetest victory came exactly 1 year later. The Vance family corporate headquarters, a massive glass-fronted building in the heart of downtown Atlanta, was seized by the bank during the bankruptcy proceedings. It sat empty for months, a glaring symbol of their spectacular downfall. Last week, the bank put the building up for public auction. I attended the auction anonymously through a holding company, and I bought it. I bought the very building where Marcus had sat in his corner office and planned his betrayal. I bought the building where Brad had arrogantly smirked while drafting the paperwork to steal my money. I bought the symbol of their generational wealth for absolute pennies on the dollar. I am not going to use it as an office. I do not need a corner suite to feel important. I am currently gutting the entire building, tearing down the mahogany walls and the crystal chandeliers. I am converting their prestigious corporate headquarters into a massive climate-controlled storage warehouse for my luxury maternity brand. The physical manifestation of their elitist pride is now holding boxes of premium baby blankets and organic nursing pillows. I sit here now in the quiet of my penthouse, looking out over the Atlanta skyline. The sun is just beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the exact city where I was once told I did not belong. The same city where an archaic, toxic legacy was systematically dismantled and a new, unbreakable empire was born. The air up here is perfectly still, and for the first time in my entire life, it belongs entirely to me. My daughter is asleep in the nursery down the hall, safe, loved, and completely oblivious to the war that was fought to secure her absolute freedom. She will grow up knowing that her mother did not just survive the fire, she learned how to control the flames. The journey from that cramped, sterile hospital room to this velvet sofa was not easy. It required a level of psychological discipline and brutal patience that tested the very limits of my soul. When Marcus, Vivian, and Brad threw their absolute worst at me, they expected a loud, chaotic reaction. They expected the angry, uneducated stereotype they had so carefully constructed in their narrow minds. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to cry and beg for a seat at their crumbling table. But I gave them absolutely nothing. I gave them a blank, quiet canvas, and they happily painted their own spectacular destruction right across it. There is a profound, terrifying power in absolute stillness. When you refuse to react to someone's cruelty, you force your enemies to overplay their entire hand. You let them become intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. You let them boast, you let them threaten, and you let them build their own inescapable traps. The loudest people in the room are always the most vulnerable because they tell you exactly what they are going to do before they even do it. So to any woman watching this right now who is currently sitting in the dark, to the woman enduring the disrespect, the bitter betrayal, or the daily condescension of people who believe they hold all the cards, listen to me very carefully. Ladies, never let them think your silence is weakness. Sometimes silence just means you are reloading. Take your time, gather your receipts, build your empire in the shadows, and let them sleep soundly in their arrogance until the exact moment you decide to wake them up. I want to hear from you. Have you ever smiled through blatant disrespect while quietly orchestrating your own ultimate victory? Have you ever stepped back and simply let your enemies dig their own graves? Tell me your stories in the comments below. Let this community be a living testament to the unstoppable power of the quiet storm. Do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you are ready to stop being the victim and start being the architect of your own life. Until next time, stay strong, stay focused, and remember who holds the real power.